I'm pretty sure that all of us, more or less, have heard about suspensions in our life. And almost all of us have a general idea about what a suspension is. We all know that in vehicles with wheels, like cars, motorbikes, trucks or some bicycles, the vehicle itself is not connected to the wheel with a rigid pole, but it's connected through the suspensions. So every time we accelerate, we brake, we turn, or we pass over a disconnection, the movements that are triggered are not rigid, but they are gentle, progressive and comfortable. For example, when you ride a bicycle with no suspensions, everything vibrates all the time. While if you ride a bicycle with suspensions, everything is smoother and more gentle. So the thing is that suspensions have not been invented just for comfort, but they have many functions. First of all, comfort. Obviously, a vehicle with suspensions is more comfortable. But the second reason is for stability and security. If we imagine the world as a sphere completely flat like a pool, with vehicles running on it without accelerating or braking or turning, the wheels always have the same load, so you don't need suspensions. But obviously the world is not like that. You have to brake, accelerate, you pass over the holes and the ground and you pass over stones. So while driving, we have load transfers that occur continuously. And if you don't know what load transfer is, I made a video about that and I linked it below. So the suspensions are meant to dampen this load transfer by absorbing and damping and preventing the tire from being overloaded. Let's look at this example. If we imagine that our tire is represented by the balloon and my arm is the mechanism that connects the vehicle to the wheel and the tire, if my arm is a stiff pole, you can see that every movement that happens squeezes the tire. So the tire is always overloaded. Not only being the connection rigid, every time I hit a bump, there is the risk that the tire bounces, making the wheel not touching the ground anymore, making me losing contact with the ground, making me losing control, and if I am on a motorcycle, eventually making me fall. But if, on the other hand, my arm is not a stiff pole, but it's a suspension, which dampens the movement, you can see how the tire is much less squeezed. Because my arm, which is the suspension, is absorbing these load transfers. Not only by absorbing the bumps, if the suspension is set up properly, the tire always sticks to the ground. And this is another fundamental task of the suspensions. They always keep the tire stuck to the ground. This makes the vehicle more stable and more safe. And the third reason is for the setup. All the suspensions can be adjusted to change the setup of the vehicle in every part of the driving, improving its performance. For example, especially in racing, being able to find the correct setup can make a huge difference between winning and losing, between riding safely or crashing. So many of you asked me a video about how to regulate the suspensions, but the truth is that it's an extremely complicated and complex topic of which I know really a small part. And moreover, if I make 8 hours of lessons, they would not be enough. Because I can explain you the basics, but even if you know the basics, it's not enough. Because for example, if you change the stiffness of the spring on the rear suspension on a motorbike, the effect that you have depends on the front suspension, on the tire, on the electronics, on the weather, on the temperature, on the preload. So each time you change one thing, you don't always have the same effect. So it's too complicated. So this is a topic that I will keep there in standby. And if you really want to know how to do the setup for your bike, you must go to attend a course made by specialists. And it takes hours or days. In this video, however, I want to show you how the suspensions work and how the regulations that you make work. So a few months ago, if you remember, I went to Andreani, which is a world leader company in suspensions, and I made a tour of their warehouse to show you how they build suspensions for cars, motorbikes and bicycles. And in that day, they allowed me to see inside the suspensions to see how they work. So today I will show you it in this video. Before looking into the models, let's see what's the logic behind the suspension is. So we have our vehicle and the wheels. Initially, the vehicle was connected directly to the wheels in a rigid way, but this made driving them a nightmare, especially on uneven roads, and all the roads at that time were uneven. Furthermore, all the hits that the wheel take are directly transferred to the whole vehicle, which after start to tear apart. and falling to pieces. So they looked for a solution. The idea was to separate the vehicles from the wheels and to connect the vehicle to the wheels with the mechanism capable of absorbing the hits. Therefore, we have the unsprung masses, which are the wheels, the brakes, the tires, and we have the suspended masses, which is all the rest of the vehicle, which is connected to the wheels with the suspensions. And this is why they're called suspensions, because they support the suspended masses. Now, I don't want to tell you all the historical excursus of all the vehicles, all the suspensions, but I just want to show you the basics. If we want to absorb an impact or a load transfer, we need an elastic component, which is something capable of compressing and releasing. So we did a spring. Springs are perfect for this task, because when the vehicle passes on a stone or has a load transfer, the spring compresses, and when it has passed over the stone, the springs extends back. However, there is a problem. If we compress the spring with some energy, once it extends back, it releases back the energy, and it will make the vehicle bounce. So once the vehicle lands back, it compresses again the spring, which again extends and makes the vehicle bounce. So you may say, okay, I don't want the vehicle to bounce, I will put a harder spring. But it doesn't change anything, because even if the spring is harder, once you compress with some energy, the spring gives you back the same energy. Even if you put a softer spring, once you compress it with that energy, it gives you back the energy. So changing the K of the spring, which is the constant that determines the stiffness of the spring, does not change the fact that the vehicle will bounce. So of course the spring mitigates the impact, but it leads the vehicle to start bouncing and can make it very unstable and dangerous. So we need something to dampen those elastic movements. Something that stops them or slows them down. This is why the dampers or shock absorbers have been invented. The shock absorbers are components of the suspensions which serve to dampen these elastic forces that are created by the spring. And there are many types of shock absorbers. We have the hydraulics, which use liquids like oil. We have the pneumatic, which is gases. We have the magnetics, which use magnetic forces. We have the frictions, which use the friction between two components, and we have the mass damper, which use some suspended masses. It becomes a very complex topic to look into it. This is not a degree course. So we will talk just about the most common ones, which are the hydraulic suspensions. So let's take this syringe as an example. How does it work? We have the tank in which the liquid is stored. We have a piston which pushes the liquid back and forth, and we have a hole in which the liquid is forced to pass. So you may ask, why are we putting some liquid inside? Because the liquid is uncompressible. For example, if we fill the tank with the fluid and we cover the hole, you can see that I cannot compress it anymore, because the liquid is incompressible. Instead, if we fill the tank with air and we cover the hole, you can see that I compress it, because the air is a gas and the gas is compressible. So what happens when we open the hole? If we compress the piston, the liquid starts to go out through the hole. But the piston compresses slowly, because the fact that the fluid is forced to pass through the hole makes the movement slow down. So let's imagine that my arm is the spring, which wants to compress and extend quickly. If the spring is connected to the piston, which is forced to push the oil through that hole, the movement of my arm, which is the spring, is slowed down, is absorbed, it's dampened. So this is the mechanism that is at the base of the functioning of the hydraulic suspensions. The oscillation of the spring is slowed down by the hydraulic shock absorber, which is composed of a liquid, the oil, which is forced to pass through a hole. Not only that, the smaller the hole, the more time it takes for the fluid to pass through it, the slower the movement of the suspension is. So by reducing or increasing the diameter of the hole, you can change the speed at which the suspension works. Now, the syringe was just an example to make you understand the idea. Obviously, the suspension is something more complex. So this idea of a piston pushing the oil through some holes, how is it implemented in the suspensions? This idea is implemented through the needles and the shims that we will now see in detail. Let's look now into a practical example with some animations, and we will see the Ohlins TTX, which is the rear suspension of my Yamaha R1.
Okay, here we have the Ohlins TTX. As you can see, the structure is as I showed you earlier. We have the spring, and inside the spring we have the shock absorber. And if we zoom inside, you can see that here is the spring, and here we have our kind of syringe, because we have our piston, which goes inside and pushes the oil through these two registers where we have the holes that now we will understand how they work. So what happens? During compression, the spring is compressed and the piston pushes the oil, while during extension, the opposite happens, because the spring is released and the piston sucks the oil. Now, if we look here into the left, we can see the path that the oil follows. And we have two things to notice. The first is that during compression, the oil follows one path, while during the extension, the oil follows another path indicated by the red arrows. So, blue arrows, the path for the compression, while red arrows, the path for the extension. And the other thing to notice is that here you have these two registers, which are one for the compression and one for the extension. And with these two wheels, you can regulate the clicks. But we will see them in a few minutes. Now, let's go deeper to understand how they work. I'm sorry about the resolution, but the video is already low quality, and if we zoom, the quality gets even worse, but I just want you to understand. Look at how the blue arrows, which indicates the path that the oil follows, show us that the oil can follow two separate paths. Some of the oil exits through this hole, while some of the oil exits through this hole. Look at that. Some oil is going down, some oil is going here. Some oil is going down, some oil is going here. And the same happens for rebound. Some oil exits from the bottom, some oil exits from the top. Why is that? Because one part is passing through the needle, while another part is passing through the shim. And now you will understand what the needles and the shims are and what is their purpose.
Because the regulations in the suspensions are done in two ways, with the needles and the shims. Let's start by the needles. Let's take our syringe that we talked about. Do you remember that I showed you that by shrinking the hole, you reduce the oil passage? This is made through the needle. This is an example of needle. The needle enters into the hole, and the deeper it goes, the more the hole gets closed, and therefore the oil finds it harder to pass through.
Now, in this animation, you can see how the needles are made. For example, here we have our two registers, one for the compression and one for the extension, and one for the rebound. And here you have the needles. So now look at here. I am going to close the needle. We are going to close the rebound so that the needle goes down, and the oil, indicated by the red arrow, finds it harder to pass through. Look at here. See, the needle goes down, the oil finds it harder to pass. Same for the compression. The needle is down and the oil finds it harder to pass. So now be careful, this is a bicycle suspension which don't have the shims. So if you're wondering where the shims are, it doesn't have the shim. But I just wanted to show it to you to make you understand how the needles work.
And this is the regulation that you do through the clicks. By opening, the needle comes out. By closing, the needle gets in. Let's talk now about the shims. If one part of the oil passes through the hole where the needle is located, one other part of the oil passes through the shims. The shims are just some metal flexible discs. These discs cover the oil passage. When the oil pushes, the shims bend and let the oil pass. So by changing the number of the shims and the hardness of the shims, you change the force that the oil needs to apply to bend them and to pass through. And the shims can be a lot, as you can see from this video, where I show you a motocross suspension. Obviously, changing the needle is easy, because you just need to change the clicks, either with a screwdriver or with the wheel. It depends on how the suspension is made. While changing the shims is a bit more complicated, because you need to open the suspension and physically change the part. So let's recap. The more you take out the needle, the more you open the oil passage, the more the oil finds it easy to pass through the hole where the needle is located, and the less the oil is forced to pass through the shim, because it needs some effort to bend the shims. While the more you put the needle inside, the more you close the hole, making it hard for the oil to pass, and forcing the oil to bend the shim and pass through them. So now you're probably wondering why we need to modify in a separate way the compression and the extension. This is done for a very specific reason. Especially on racing vehicles, the riders and the mechanics have the need to be able to adjust the suspensions in the compression or in the rebound separately. For example, for a reason that depends on the way the rider rides, or the tires, or the electronics, or tarmac, or whatever, you may want to have a suspension that compresses quickly but rebounds slowly. That's why you have these two different separate regulations. So now that you know how the suspension works, I'll show you how the regulations work. Let's take, for example, another suspension, which is not an Ohlins TTX, but this is the only animation that I found.
So now here we have a bicycle suspension, which is a TTX, but has some differences from the motorbike suspension, which we will see in a few seconds. But I want to use this animation to show you how it is possible that the oil follows two different paths, whether it's in compression or in a rebound. For example, we are in compression, the oil follows the blue path. So it passes through these registers, it goes all around the chamber and returns back to the piston. While during the rebound, it follows the red path through the registers and returns to the chamber. And if we zoom inside the registers, we can see how they work. I just want to remind you that this suspension in particular doesn't have the shims. So if you don't see them, don't worry. You see that here you have the needles, and here you have these two bypasses, which can be either open, like this one, or closed, like this one. And they can change, because this one can open and this one can close. And how they open or close. For example, we are now in the rebound phase. So during the rebound, the oil comes through this path. So the oil is pushing from the bottom, so it's forcing the bypass to close. So being the bypass closed, the oil is forced to pass through the needle. While when the oil reaches the other register, it forces the bypass to open, so it's not forced to pass through the needle, but it passes through the bypass. While during the compression, you saw that the oil closed this bypass, so it's forced to pass through the needle, and it opens this bypass. And why are the bypasses important? Because if, for example, now we change the needles and we close the passage, look at here, during the rebound, we close the passage and the oil is forced to pass through the closed passage through the needle, while it is not forced to pass through the compression needle, because considering that the oil finds the path closed, it just passes through the bypass. So the setup change that we apply in the compression does not affect the oil during the rebound phase. And it's true the other way around. During the compression, the oil is forced to pass through the needle, but it doesn't pass through the rebound needle, while it passes through the bypasses. And this mechanism is simple yet genius.
And what about the fork? How does it work? Most of the forks are composed this way. You have the pipes, called sterns, and inside those tubes you have the cartridges, which is the actual suspension, inside which you find the mechanism that I have shown you earlier. And there are various types of cartridges. For example, here you have the example that Andreani showed to me. See how they are? They are sectioned, they are cut, so you can see inside the way they work. So we have the traditional ones that nowadays are used less and less, in which each cartridge is responsible of controlling both the compression and the rebound. Then we have the cartridges which are most used today, where one cartridge deals with compression and the other cartridge deals with the rebound. And that's right, maybe you didn't know, I didn't know that either until 1 year ago. In a fork, it's not necessary that the two tubes do the same job. They don't need to be identical. They're not like our legs, which need to be balanced. One can perform one task and the other one can perform another task. For example, if we put two 95 springs, where 95 identifies the K of the spring, which is the constant that determines the stiffness of the spring, the total result of the fork is 95. But if we put one 95 and one 100, the stiffness of the fork is the average of the two of them, which is 97.5. So yeah, when you change the setup, usually you change just one spring. And then we have the pressurized cartridges, in which the cartridge is hermetically sealed and pressurized. I won't explain you why it's pressurized, it's very complicated, but imagine it as an evolution of the non-pressurized ones. Then we also have forks without cartridges, you see? The suspensions and the tubes are one single component. And what is the difference in practice? Why the cartridges are better than this? That's for two reasons. The first is that when the suspension compresses, the tubes flex a little bit. So if the tube is the suspension itself flex. But if you have the cartridge inside the tube, only the tube flexes and not the cartridge, which is better. And the second reason is that if you crash and you bend the tubes, like I did in my crash last year, you can throw away the tubes and save the cartridge, like I did, and save money. One important thing to notice is that by changing the clicks, so changing the compression and the rebound, you don't change the final position that the suspension reaches, but you just change how quickly or slowly the suspension reaches that final position. For example, if you realize that while braking, the fork reaches the limit, I don't know the exact expression to say it in English, probably bottoms out. By the way, one common misconception and one common mistake is to say, okay, if I'm reaching the bottom, I can close the compression so the oil finds it harder to pass through the needle and the fork does not reach the bottom. This is wrong because the fork will reach anyway the bottom. It will just reach it later because changing compression and rebound only changes the speed at which the suspension works. So if you want to change the final position of the suspension, you need to change some other things like the spring stiffness or the preload. So that's it. This is how the suspensions work. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. I hope it helped you to understand the mechanism behind the suspensions. And if you liked it, please let me know with a like, with a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye bye!